Welcome back to the Farm Show on Westplex Talk 1045. This is B Block, the second segment of our show for December 6th, 2025. In B Block, we usually focus on production. In the summer and fall, we focused a lot on agronomic recommendations. The last couple months in B Block, we focused on beef production for our cattle producers. But today we're going to go back to row crop production. In the last few months, we've heard agronomic recommendations in B Block from the good folks from Stein Seed, from Beck's Hybrids, from Mershman Seeds, and others. Today, we're going to go back to probably my favorite set of agronomic recommendations, and that's from Lance Tarochione. He's from the DEKALB Asgrow Western Illinois team. They have a fantastic YouTube page that you can find by looking up DEKALB Asgrow Western Illinois. And the feature they run is called Ask the Agronomist. Let's get right into it. Lance started the most recent episode, which was right before Thanksgiving, by talking about variability in soybeans and corn. Here's what Lance had to say.
So I guess I'm gonna start with the premise that some of you raised phenomenally good soybeans in 25. Some of you did not. So soybean yields were variable, which variable yields are normal. If we ever have a year where yields are not variable, that would be really weird. So there were beans that struggled to make 60. There were beans that were over 90. And, if you had some of the ones that struggled to make 60, you don't want to hear about somebody else's making 90. And if your beans made 90, you're probably surprised to find out that some people had beans that barely made 60. So, the difference between 60 and 90 is, pretty dramatic, obviously. Has a big impact on your profitability, has a big impact on your pride and how you feel about yourself as a soybean producer, and probably has a big impact on how happy you are with your seed supplier, and the kind of conversations you're having with your seed supplier. Now, your seed supplier may not have a damn thing to do with why your beans only made 60, or frankly, why your beans made 90. That probably has more to do with the weather and your management than it does where you buy your beans, just to be truthfully blunt about it. Because I've seen some beans that aren't very good make 100, and I've seen soybeans that are outstanding make 50. So there's lots of mystery, lots of confusion, lots of frustration around what drives yield in soybeans. How and I think most farmers feel I've always argued this a little bit. I think guys are generally more comfortable that they understand corn, and soybeans frustrate and confuse them because you never know what they're going to make. They almost never make what you thought they were going to make. They're either worse than you thought or better than you thought. They seem unpredictable. I don't know that they're that much more variable and unpredictable than corn, because when your corn you thought was going to make 300 makes 200. That's kind of a surprise. And it's a third different than what you thought. And when your soybeans that you thought were going to make 90 make 60, that's also a third different than you thought. So I don't know. I think we sometimes think soybeans are a lot different than corn, and to me, both crops are highly variable, responsive to management, responsive to weather, responsive to lots of things that happen to them, and yields can range from awful to disappointing to satisfying to amazing in both crops.
Lance said that this time of year, he gets a lot of questions about residue management and tillage. Here's what he tells growers.
Been a lot of talk this year about tillage and residue management. I did vertical tillage on my farm on all my corn stalks going to soybeans for next year for the first time in my life. Honestly, I have been slow to embrace the fact that if you're going to do early planted soybeans and you're going to try to raise 80 bushel beans consistently, you need to be doing some tillage. Now, you don't need to get out the moldboard plow. I don't know that you need to rip every acre, although there are people that, are raising some really good soybeans. I have a colleague, their standard program for soybeans is, they spray a biological for enhanced stalk decomposition, they vertical till, and then they rip on the same acre. That's uber aggressive, raise some damn good beans. And whether or not a program like that would interest you, I don't have time to farm that way, just to be quite brutally honest with you. I have a hard time getting across my acres one time, let alone 3 times with 3 different operations. So that does not appeal to me. But his beans are a heck of a lot better than mine. So there's something to what they're doing. And, basically when we talk about, residue management, that could be tillage, that could be decomposition of residue, that could be nutrient cycling, and that could be influencing what kind of spring seed bed you have to plant into. And that spring seed bed that you're planting into, that's kind of the issue with planting soybeans early, especially if you're on lighter, lower organic matter, poorly drained, slow to warm up soils. If they're completely covered with heavy corn residue, which good corn makes a lot of residue, the better our corn gets, the more residue we're going to have to deal with. That's a stress on soybeans early in the season. It slows them down. You generally get an acceptable stand. It just takes a long time. And I often remind people, planting date is irrelevant. Now, you might think that sounds crazy because we all talk about the importance of planting date. The date you plant is irrelevant. The date your soybeans canopy, the date your soybeans start to flower, the number of days that they flower, the uniformity of your stand, none of those things are irrelevant. That's what we're trying to accomplish with earlier planting dates is earlier canopy development, more sunlight capture, early flowering, more days in reproductive growth stages. And none of that happens if it takes your soybeans 50 days to come up. So if you plant April 1st and your soybeans come up on May 10th, and you plant April 1st and your soybeans come up on April 15th, there's a big difference in yield potential between those 2 April 1st planting dates. So that is the issue that our residue is causing. It is delaying emergence of early planted soybeans, and that is reducing the yield potential of early planted soybeans because it's not the planting date that matters. It's the emergence date, it's the flowering date, it's the rate of canopy development. And so doing whatever we can do to keep the residue from negatively impacting, slowing down the growth of our soybeans. And there's other things we do that slow down the growth of our soybeans. Herbicides, for example, can slow down the growth of your soybeans. Certain seed treatments can slow down the growth of your soybeans. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't use them. I mean, obviously, we need our herbicides, and the best water hemp programs in the world, tend to slow down the growth of your soybeans. Some of our seed treatments that control nematodes and protect us from sudden death can slow down the growth of your soybeans. So that seems counterintuitive, and if you can use products that are just as effective at protecting your plants from diseases and nematodes and weeds that do not slow down the growth of your soybeans, you're probably going to prefer those. Now, people are going to argue about that are the products that tend to not slow your soybeans down, are they as good? Are they as effective? I could argue they're not, but there's a trade-off there. And that's up to you to decide which trade-off you want to make.
If you're just tuning in here on Westplex Talk 104.5, you're listening to The Farm Show. That's Farm and Ranch, Missouri. And right now, we're playing a few select clips from the DEKALB Asgrow team, DEKALB Asgrow, Western Illinois to be specific. Lance Tarochione, famed agronomist, is talking about soybeans quite often on the Ask the Agronomist web series. The focus is pretty corn heavy, but right now Lance is about to go into soybean production and what to think about when you think about crop rotation.
If you want to raise better beans, lengthening out your crop rotation is one of the most effective ways to do that. Now, you have to have other crops that you want to grow, or you have to be able to manage corn on corn. Not all of us want to manage corn on corn. That's riskier too. And if you feel you can raise consistently good corn on corn, then you're going to come out ahead because your beans are going to absolutely be better. I get really frustrated with people that win a yield contest and they get asked to come speak at a conference, and they're talking about their fertility program and they're talking about their variety selection, and some seed company is promoting that they're going to be there and obviously taking a lot of credit for the success that they had. And they talk about go on and on about their fungicide program and their fertility, and they do this, they do that, and micronutrients and tissue testing, and there's all this secret sauce that goes into their success. And then you find out there hadn't been soybeans in this field for 20 years. And it's like, well, that's cheating. There needs to be a separate yield contest category for 50-50 rotated beans, because if you're consistently beating 80 on 50-50 rotated beans, that's more impressive to me than somebody that raises 100 in a field that had beans in it for 20 years. So we got to be honest about that. If you can lengthen your rotation out, that's going to add bushels to your beans just like that, without even changing anything else in your management program.
This is also the time of year where Lance gets a lot of questions about soil fertility. Here's what he tells growers.
There's lots of different opinions out there. There's lots of products you can use. You can use dry, you can use liquid, you can do fall, you can do spring, you can do foliar, you can do in crop, you can go crazy. You can go broke. There's no limit to what you can do with your fertility program. So when I say fertility, I'm talking primarily PK and sulfur. You can ask the question about what about nitrogen on high yielding soybeans? And in theory, once soybean yields get above 75 or 80, it's going to be difficult for them to find and make the amount of nitrogen that they need to produce that yield. Now, results of nitrogen fertilization on soybeans have been very sketchy. Yield responses range from no response to some response but it wasn't a positive ROI, to occasionally you see a response that was big enough that the ROI was positive on it. I don't really think nitrogen fertilization in soybeans is the secret to high yielding soybeans, but there are situations, especially on low organic matter soils, sandy soils, where the addition of nitrogen can help. Lots of arguments on what the right timing is, when to put it on, when to not put it on, what form to use. Foliar is not the solution. Not nitrogen is soybeans require. This is, some people don't really realize this. Soybeans require more nitrogen than corn. They just make enough of their own that we don't have to apply it. So the nitrogen that the soybeans require is coming from nitrogen fixation. Oh, which reminds me, I need to add another thing to my seed treatment list. Inoculant. Running out of room on the seed to put all the things you can put on in a seed treatment. That's coming up. So, if you've never done the math on how much P and K and sulfur is required for 100 bushel soybeans, do that exercise. It's humbling. If you're trying to raise 300 bushel corn and 100 bushel soybeans, you're probably not using enough fertilizer to do that. And you might not have enough base soil fertility to support that yield level. So fertility is important. pH is an important part of that. If you're trying to do it on a soil with a pH of 8 or a pH of 5, probably not going to happen for you because you've got too many nutrient availability issues because your pH is jacked up. So try to get a pH in the mid sixes. I'd say low to mid sixes is where you want to be on a water pH, not buffer pH. You can use buffer pH, but the scale's different. Some people get confused on buffer pH. A buffer pH is a higher number. The buffer pH always makes it look like you don't need any lime, which is not true, because the scale for liming based on buffer pH is completely different than the scale for liming based on water pH. I don't think buffer pH is better than regular pH. You can use either one of them, but you got to realize they have a different scale. So you can't just switch to buffer pH and go, oh, cool, I don't need lime anymore. That's not the purpose of buffer pH. Some states, some fertility experts would prefer to use buffer pH. I think you can use either one. You just got to be using the appropriate scale for whichever one you choose to use. So that's my sermon on buffer pH.
All right, Lance, what about micronutrients? Surely there's some misunderstandings there. What do you tell growers?
Just remember, with fertility, the vast majority of fertility that a plant is going to take up is going to come in with the water through the roots. And you need the fertility in the soil, not on the leaves. That doesn't mean that we can't do some foliar amendments. That doesn't mean that there aren't things that you can't, help a plant with foliarly. But when you talk to the Alex Harrells of the world and all those high yield guys, and they're putting stuff on through their pivots, and you're thinking, man, I wish I had a pivot so I could fertilize every day if I wanted to. That's not foliar fertility that they're putting on through the pivot. That's soil fertility, because it's going on it might land on the leaf, but it gets washed off the leaf and it goes into the soil, and it's getting into the plant through the roots. So God designed plants to eat through their roots, just like, he did not decide, my colleague, Jim Donnelly, he said, if you try to eat a hamburger by shoving it in your arm, you're going to starve to death. You can eat a hamburger by putting it in your mouth. You can't eat a hamburger by shoving it through your arm. And that might be a little bit, exaggeration for, the reason we need to fertilize the soil more than we need to fertilize the leaves. But, we can get some incremental gains with foliar stuff, but the bulk of it needs to get in through the roots, especially our macronutrients. I mean, nitrogen, for example, when a soybean plant needs, 4 pounds of nitrogen a day, putting 2/100 of a pound of it on the leaf, it's about 3 minutes worth of nitrogen for that plant. So not saying that there aren't benefits to those products, not saying there's not a place for them, but you cannot ignore your soil fertility. Everything starts with the soil. Get your soil right, get your fertility levels right. And that's one thing that I think I see pretty consistently is the guys who raise the best beans, they're doing all this stuff, but they also have really good soil tests. And in the current economic environment we're in, with the fertility costs we're in, I hear lots of people wanting to skimp on fertility. Be careful doing that. If your soil tests are already kind of shaky and you start skimping on stuff, that's going to catch up with you eventually. Now, I get it. You can't go broke putting fertilizer on. Well, you can, but you shouldn't. And so, we gotta be smart about it, but we also have to recognize that if you don't put on as much as your crop is removing, and you do that long enough, you're not going to be raising the same crop that you used to be raising. So that's just that's a biological, scientific, agronomic fact that is undeniable. We need to maintain good base soil fertility.
All right, we are right up against break, so I'm going to have to leave it there for now. To hear the full conversation that Lance put forth, you can go to YouTube and check out DEKALB, Asgrow, Western Illinois. In the remaining parts of the Ask the Agronomist segment, Lance covers things like row spacing, weed control, so much more. Go check it out. You're listening to The Farm Show. That's Farm and Ranch, Missouri, on Westplex Talk 104.5. We'll be right back.